Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Welcome back to Voluble Minds. Next up is our one-work-strong Boethius unit, in which we will be sampling his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy. Those of you who may have read John Kennedy Toole's picaresque novel A Confederacy of Dunces may already be familiar with the name Boethius from the blustery ramblings of its main character, Ignatius Riley. In the video following this introduction, you will get to see in Boethius' own words what Ignatius was on about and if his invocations of Fortuna were apt. The Consolation, in its odes and lamentations to fortune in the sight of Lady Philosophy, precedes by about 7 centuries the still popular Goliardic Latin verse of O Fortuna from the medieval poetry collection Carmina Burana, which likely outlives its own lyric appeal thanks to the composer Karl Orff. Boethius lived from 477 to 524 AD, giving us about a millennial gap between this dialogue and the next one we'll be exploring, that of Galileo. Boethius, a Roman from an old family, served the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who had made his way across the Alps and established rule over Italy. Theodoric would eventually imprison and execute Boethius for seditious conspiracy, without grounds if Boethius is to be believed. Boethius was at the time holding the illustrious office of Magister Officiorum. It is from prison that Boethius composed The Consolation of Philosophy. His fate thus harmonizes with that of Socrates in Crito, with which we closed out our Plato unit. But this isn't all that unites him with Platonic tradition. Boethius was a translator of Plato and Aristotle from Greek to Latin, and is celebrated today as a significant contributor to the preservation of classical texts for their eventual resurgence in modern Europe. And thus, this dialogue is perhaps the single most pivotal in this series, and represents a bridge across our longest time jump. The Consolation of Philosophy is a standout in this series, not only for featuring the writer himself sans pseudonym, but also for not being a dialogue between two humans. In this dialogue, philosophy itself is personified as a lady, and holds counsel with Boethius throughout. A major focus of the work is that of theodicy, or the question of how the divine good can be vindicated even in the face of an evil or imperfect world. The question of happiness, in spite of the caprice of an also personified fortune, also comes up, and it becomes clearer and clearer how literal and apt the piece's title is. Boethius, at the end of an otherwise impressive career, is readying himself for what may come, and wringing some final, self-generated satisfaction out of the act of philosophizing. Boethius was nominally a Christian, and heavily influenced by Platonic thought, granted some liberality of personal interpretation. But he wasn't alone in this. This Platonic through-line is somewhat borrowed by Boethius from Augustine, himself owing Plato, though a pagan, for many of the ideas which led him from his Manichaean, dualistic beliefs into Christianity. Augustine's works, including some dialogues, won't be read in this first series, but many of his most interesting ideas are put quite adequately by Boethius, who was born about a half-century after Augustine's death. The problem of the incompatibility of free will with divine omniscience, and thus with the survival of personal responsibility, is solved, at least to his satisfaction, with a version of Augustine's concept of an eternal present. Our temporal linear experience of unfolding events, and the choices within them, grants us an essential freedom, but is not a proper way to gauge the divine mind. Augustine's conception of privative evil, that is, evil not as a concrete measurable substance, but rather the deterioration of or straying from the good, also figures heavily here. Wickedness, in this viewpoint, is not empowered to overtake the good, because it is by definition miserable and lessened by good's absence. Thus we must pity the wicked. Their state of lessened good is itself punishment. Christian thinkers like Augustine and Boethius also appreciated Plato's notion of the immortal soul, which we heard spoken of in Meno. We must also acknowledge Boethius' indebtedness to Aristotle, the major necessary omission from our series, not having any surviving dialogues, but nonetheless a referenced specter roughly equal with Plato throughout. Among other things not covered in our dialogic selections for purposes of time, Lady Philosophy borrows from Aristotle's physics the idea that chance and accidents are defined as unexpected results flowing from a concurrence of causes where the several factors had some definite end. In other words, the coincident event to emerge may not itself have been intentional or designed, but had discernible necessary causes. This meets a standard for chance and accident as they understood it, and purely by accident, it isn't a bad explanation of how a physically deterministic universe might be a source of causes without a prescribed purpose. The Consolation is divided into 5 main sections, themselves divided across a total of 39 subsections. I strongly urge all who find our excerpts interesting to treat themselves to the fuller experience. It is not a dialogue in its entirety, but also includes long prose and verse sections. Even the dialogic parts in the original are narratively conveyed, requiring some reformatting and adapting it to the pure dialogue you will see here. Ultimately, the dialogue serves to humble our human entitlement to fortune, fortuna, and our indignation when it fails to subordinate itself to our needs. Being fickle by nature, how could we expect otherwise of it except by necessarily changing it to be something other than what we take fortune to essentially mean, which is fickleness? As you listen to our survey of this work, consider whether these arguments would serve to console you in extremis. And do you think free will, so long as it has recourse to the faculties of reason and refusal, can exist even in the face of an all-knowing divine overseer? This is another episode in which we will have a post-dialogic discussion, covering Boethius' relationship to other philosophers preceding him, and ways in which this free will question has endured in Christian factionalism. We will be using the translation of the Consolation of Philosophy by H.R. James, which is in the public domain. I'm joined today by Annie Winneg, an excellent classical actor with whom I've been most fortunate to share the stage many times, starting back at our shared alma mater, Oberlin College. She has performed professionally in both regional and NYC theaters, including multiple world premieres of new works, and you can catch her briefly on Season 2 of Miss Maisel. If you are a New Yorker, you may have seen her in the off-Broadway hit Drunk Shakespeare, in which she performed for over 400 shows. She will be gracing us with her reading of Lady Philosophy to my Boethius in this, The Consolation of Philosophy.
First then, wilt thou suffer me by a few questions, to make some attempt to test the state of thy mind, that I may learn in what way to set about thy cure?
Ask what thou wilt, for I will answer whatever questions thou choosest to put.
This world of ours, thinkest thou it is governed haphazard and fortuitously, or believest thou that there is in it any rational guidance?
Nay, in no wise may I deem that such fixed motions can be determined by random hazard, but I know that God, the Creator, presideth over his work, nor will the day ever come that shall drive me from holding fast the truth of this belief.
Yes, thou didst even but now affirm it in song, lamenting that men alone had no portion in the divine care. As to the rest, thou wert unshaken in the belief that they were ruled by reason. Yet I marvel exceedingly how, in spite of thy firm hold on this opinion, thou art fallen into sickness. Now tell me, since thou doubtest not that God governs the world, dost thou perceive by what means he rules it?
I scarcely understand what thou meanest, much less can I answer thy question.
But tell me, dost thou remember the universal end towards which the aim of all nature is directed?
I once heard, but sorrow hath dulled my recollection.
And yet thou knowest whence all things have proceeded.
Yes, that I know, and have answered that it is from God.
Yet how is it possible that thou knowest not what is the end of existence, when thou dost understand its source and origin? However, these disturbances of mind have forced to shake a man's position, but cannot pluck him up and root him altogether out of himself. But answer this also, I pray thee. Rememberest thou that thou art a man?
How should I not?
Then canst thou say what man is?
Is this thy question? Whether I know myself for a being endowed with reason and subject to death? Surely I do acknowledge myself such.
Dost know nothing else that thou art?
Nothing.
Now I know another cause of thy disease, one too of grave moment. Thou hast ceased to know thine own nature. So then I have made full discovery both of the causes of thy sickness and the means of restoring thy health. It is because forgetfulness of thyself hath bewildered thy mind, that thou hast bewailed thee as an exile, as one stripped of the blessings that were his. It is because thou knowest not the end of existence that thou deemst abominable and wicked men to be happy and powerful, while because thou hast forgotten by what means the earth is governed, thou deemst that fortune's changes ebb and flow without the restraint of a guiding hand. These are serious enough to cause not sickness only, but even death. But, thanks be to the author of our health, the light of nature hath not yet left thee utterly. In thy true judgment concerning the world's government, in that thou believest it subject not to the random drift of chance, but to divine reason, we have the divine spark from which thy recovery may be hoped. Ye too, creatures of earth, have some glimmering of your origin, however faint, and though in a vision dim and clouded, yet ye discern the true end of happiness, and so the aim of nature leads you thither. to that true good, while error, in many forms, leads you astray therefrom. For reflect whether men are able to win happiness by those means through which they think to reach the proposed end. Truly, we acknowledge that some are made happy through the acquisition of either wealth or rank. But if these are not able to fulfill their promises, and moreover lack many good things, is not the happiness men seek in them clearly discovered to be a false show? Therefore do I first ask thee thyself, who but lately wert living in affluence, amid all the abundance of wealth, was thy mind never troubled in consequence of some wrong done to thee?
Nay, I cannot remember a time when my mind was so completely at peace as not to feel the pang of some uneasiness.
Was it not because either something was absent, which thou wouldst not have absent, or present, which thou wouldst have away?
Yes,
Then thou didst want the presence of the one, the absence of the other.
admitted.
But a man lacks that of which he is in want.
He does.
And he who lacks something is not in all points self-sufficing.
No, certainly not.
So wert thou then, in the plenitude of thy wealth, supporting this insufficiency?
I must have been.
Wealth, then, cannot make its possessor independent and free from all want. Yet this was what it seemed to promise. Moreover, I think this also well deserves to be considered, that there is nothing in the special nature of money to hinder its being taken away from those who possess it against their will.
I admit it.
Why, of course, when every day the stronger wrests it from the weaker without his consent. Else whence comes lawsuits, except in seeking to recover moneys which have been taken away against their owner's will by force or fraud?
True.
Then everyone will need some extraneous means of protection to keep his money safe.
Who can venture to deny it?
Yet he would not unless he possessed the money which it is possible to lose.
No, he certainly would not.
Then we have worked round to an opposite conclusion. The wealth which was thought to make a man independent rather puts him in need of further protection. How in the world then can want be driven away by riches? Cannot the rich feel hunger? Cannot they thirst? Are not the limbs of the wealthy sensitive to the winter's cold? But, thou wilt say, the rich have the wherewithal to sate their hunger, the means to get rid of thirst and cold. True enough. Want can thus be soothed by riches. Wholly removed, it cannot be. For if this ever gaping, ever craving want is glutted by wealth, it needs must be that the want itself, which can be so glutted, still remains. This much may well suffice to set forth the form of false happiness. If this is now clear to thine eyes, the next step is to show what true happiness is.
Indeed, I see clearly enough that neither is independence to be found in wealth, nor power in sovereignty, nor reverence in dignities, nor fame in glory, nor true joy in pleasures.
Hast thou discerned also the causes why this is so?
I seem to have some inkling, but I should like to learn more at large from thee.
Why, truly the reason is hard at hand. That which is simple and indivisible by nature, human error separates and transforms from the true and perfect to the false and imperfect. Dost thou imagine that which lacketh nothing can want power?
Certainly not.
Right. For if there is any feebleness of strength in anything, in this there must necessarily be need of external protection.
That is so.
Accordingly, the nature of independence and power is one and the same.
It seems so.
Well, but dost think that anything of such a nature as this can be looked upon with contempt? Or is it rather of all things most worthy of veneration?
Nay, there can be no doubt as to that.
Let us then add reverence to independence and power and conclude these three to be one.
We must, if we will acknowledge the truth.
Then, for the same reasons, this also is necessary, that independence, power, renown, reverence, and sweetness of delight are different only in name, but in substance differ nowise one from the other.
It is.
This then, which is one, and simple by nature, human perversity separates, and in trying to win a part of that which has no parts, fails to attain not only that portion, since there are no portions, but also the whole, to which it does not dream of aspiring.
How so?
He who to escape want seeks riches gives himself no concern about power. He prefers a mean and low estate, and also denies himself many pleasures dear to nature to avoid losing the money he has gained. But at this rate he does not even attain to independence. A weakling, void of strength, vexed by distresses, mean and despised, and buried in obscurity. He again who thirsts alone for power squanders his wealth, despises pleasure, and thinks fame and rank alike worthless without power. But thou seest in how many ways his state is also defective. Sometimes it happens that he lacks necessaries, that he is gnawed by anxieties, and since he cannot rid himself of these inconveniences, even ceases to have that power which was his whole end and aim. In like manner, may we cast up the reckoning in case of rank, of glory, or of pleasure. For since each one of these severally is identical with the rest, whosoever seeks any one of them without the others does not even lay hold of that one which he makes his aim. The common belief of all mankind agrees that God, the supreme of all things, is good. For since nothing can be imagined better than God, how can we doubt him to be good than whom nothing is better? Now reason shows God to be good in such wise as to prove that in him is perfect good. For were it not so, he would not be supreme of all things. For there would be something else more excellent, possessed of perfect good, which would seem to have the advantage in priority and dignity, since it has clearly appeared that all perfect things are prior to those less complete. Wherefore, lest we fall into an infinite regression, we must acknowledge the supreme God to be full of supreme and perfect good. But we have determined that true happiness is the perfect good. Therefore, true happiness must dwell in the supreme deity.
I accept thy reasonings, they cannot in any wise be disputed.
But come, see how strictly and incontrovertibly thou mayest prove our assertion that the supreme Godhead hath fullest possession of the highest good.
In what way, pray?
Do not rashly suppose that he who is the Father of all things hath received that highest good of which he is said to be possessed, either from some external source, or hath it as a natural endowment in such sort that thou mightst consider the essence of the happiness possessed and of the God who possesses it distinct and different. For if thou deemst it received from without, thou mayst esteem that which gives more excellent than that which has received. But him we most worthily acknowledge to be the most supremely excellent of all things. If, however, it is in him by nature, yet is logically distinct, the thought is inconceivable, since we are speaking of God who is supreme of all things, who was there to join these distinct essences. Finally, when one thing is different from another, the things are so conceived as distinct cannot be identical. Therefore, that which of its own nature is distinct from the highest good is not itself the highest good, an impious thought of him than whom 'tis plain nothing can be more excellent. For universally, nothing can be better in nature than the source from which it has come. Therefore, on most true grounds of reason, would I conclude that that which is the source of all things is in its own essence the highest good.
And most justly.
But the highest good has been admitted to be happiness.
Yes.
Then it is necessary to acknowledge that God is very happiness. Wouldst thou deny that every wicked man deserves punishment,
I would not, certainly.
and that those who are wicked are unhappy is clear in manifold ways?
Yes.
Thou dost not doubt then that those who deserve punishment are wretched.
Agreed.
So then, if thou wert sitting in judgment, on whom wouldst thou decree the infliction of punishment? On him who had done the wrong, or on him who had suffered it?
Without doubt, I would compensate the sufferer at the cost of the doer of the wrong.
Then the injurer would seem more wretched than the injured.
Yes, it follows. And so for this and other reasons, resting on the same ground, inasmuch as baseness of its own nature makes men wretched, it is plain that a wrong involves the misery of the doer, not the sufferer.
And yet the practice of the law courts is just the opposite. Advocates try to arouse the commiseration of the judges for those who have endured some grievous and cruel wrong, whereas pity is rather due to the criminal, who ought to be brought to the judgment seat by his accusers in a spirit not of anger, but of compassion and kindness, as a sick man to the physician, to have the ulcer of his fault cut away by punishment. The coming into being of all things, the whole course of development and things that change, every sort of thing that moves in any wise receives its due cause, order, and form from the steadfastness of the divine mind. This mind, calm in the citadel of its own essential simplicity, has decreed that the method of its rule shall be manifold. Viewed in the very purity of the divine intelligence, this method is called providence. But viewed in regard to those things which it moves and disposes, it is what the ancients called fate. So, the unfolding of this temporal order, unified into the foreview of the divine mind, is providence, while the same unity, broken up and unfolded in time, is fate. And although these are different, yet is there a dependence between them. For the order of destiny issues from the essential simplicity of providence. For as the artificer, forming in his mind beforehand the idea of the thing to be made, carries out his design and develops from moment to moment what he had before seen in a single instant as a whole, so God in his providence ordains all things as part of a single unchanging whole, but carries out these very ordinances by fate in a time of manifold unity. Dost thou then see the consequences of all that we have said?
Nay, what consequence?
That absolutely every fortune is good fortune.
And how can that be?
Attend. Since every fortune, welcome and unwelcome alike, has for its object the reward or trial of the good and the punishing or amending of the bad, every fortune must be good, since it is either just or useful.
The reasoning is exceeding true. The conclusion, so long as I reflect upon the providence and fate of which thou hast taught me, based on a strong foundation. Yet, with thy leave, we will count it among those which just now thou didst set down as paradoxical.
And why so?
Because ordinary speech is apt to assert, and that frequently, that some men's fortune is bad.
Shall we then, for a while, approach more nearly to the language of the vulgar, that we may not seem to have departed too far from the usages of men?
At thy good pleasure.
That which advantageth thou callest good, dost thou not?
Certainly.
And that which either tries or amends advantageth.
Granted.
Is good then?
Of course.
Well, this is their case, who have attained virtue and wage war with adversity, or turn from vice and lay hold on the path of virtue.
I cannot deny it.
What of the good fortune which is given as reward of the good? Do the vulgar adjudge it bad?
Anything but that, they deem it to be the best, as indeed it is.
What then of that which puts the restraint of just punishment on the bad? Though it is harsh, does popular opinion deem it good?
Nay, of all that can be imagined, it is accounted the most miserable.
Observe then if, in following popular opinion, we have not ended in a conclusion quite paradoxical.
How so?
Why, it results from our admissions that of all who have attained or are advancing in or are aiming at virtue, fortune is in every case good, while for those who remain in their wickedness, fortune by nature is always utterly bad.
You mean it is bad in that the wicked receive good fortune, or bad fortune insofar as they are still wicked?
The latter, surely, if by the vulgar use of fortune we admit of anything that could be called bad in it. For if good fortune for the wicked enforces their wickedness, surely that fortune could not be rightly called good. A wise man ought not to take it ill if ever he is involved in one of fortune's conflicts, any more than it becomes a brave soldier to be offended when at any time the trumpet sounds for battle. The time of trial is the express opportunity for the one to win glory, for the other to perfect his wisdom. Hence, indeed, virtue gets its name because, relying on its own efficacy, it yieldeth not to adversity. And ye who have taken your stand on virtue's steep ascent, it is not for you to be dissolved in delights or enfeebled by pleasure. Ye close in conflict, yea, in conflict most sharp with all fortune's vicissitudes, lest ye suffer foul fortune to overwhelm or fair fortune to corrupt you. It rests with you to make your fortune what you will. Verily, every harsh seeming fortune, if it disciplines or amends, is good. And any seeming pleasurable fortune, if serving to stray from virtue, is punishment. Seeing the fact of foreknowledge is not thought the cause of the necessity of future events, foreknowledge is not to be deemed any hindrance to the freedom of the will. Now, surely the sole ground on which thou arguest the necessity of the future is that things which are foreknown cannot fail to come to pass. But if, as thou wert ready to acknowledge just now, the fact of foreknowledge imposes no necessity on things future, what reason is there for supposing the results of voluntary action constrained to a fixed issue? Suppose, for the sake of argument, and to see what follows, we assume that there is no foreknowledge. Are willed actions then tied down to any necessity in this case? Certainly not. Let us assume foreknowledge again, but without its involving any actual necessity. The freedom of the will, I imagine, will remain in complete integrity. But that will say that although the foreknowledge is not the necessity of the future's event's occurrence, yet it is a sign that it will necessarily happen. Granted. But in this case, it is plain that even if there had been no foreknowledge, the issues would have been inevitably certain. For a sign only indicates something which is and does not bring to pass that of which it is a sign. Take an illustration that will help to convey my meaning. There are many things which we see taking place before our eyes. The movements of charioteers, for instance, in guiding and turning their cars, and so on. Now, is any one of these movements compelled by any necessity? Certainly not. There would be no efficacy in skill if all motions took place perforce. Then things which in taking place are free from any necessity as to their being in the present must also, before they take place, be about to happen without necessity. Wherefore there are things which will come to pass, the occurrence of which is perfectly free from necessity. At all events, I imagine that no one will deny that things now taking place were about to come to pass before they were actually happening. Such things, however much foreknown, are in their occurrence free. Let us now contemplate, as far as lawful, the character of the divine essence, that we may be able to understand also the nature of its knowledge. God is eternal. In this judgment, all rational beings agree. Let us then consider what eternity is. For this word carries with it a revelation alike of the divine nature and of the divine knowledge. Now, eternity is the possession of endless life, whole and perfect in a single moment. Accordingly, that which includes and possesses the whole fullness of unending life at once, from which nothing future is absent, from which nothing past has escaped, this is rightly called eternal. This must of necessity be ever present to itself in full self-possession, and hold the infinity of movable time in an abiding present. Just as ye see certain things in this your temporary present, so does he see all things in his eternal present. Wherefore this divine anticipation changes not the natures and properties of things, and it beholds things present before it, just as they will hereafter come to pass in time. Therefore, withstand vice, practice virtue, lift up your souls to right hopes, and offer humble prayers to heaven. Great is the necessity of righteousness laid upon you, if you will not hide it from yourselves, seeing that all your actions are done before the eyes of a judge who seeth all things.
16th and 17th century movements such as Arminianism and Molinism carry on Boethius' efforts to grapple with this question. Jesuit-founded Molinism, a view still held by some popular Christian apologists today, attempts to solve it by scaffolding varieties of God's knowledge, which includes logically secure propositions on one level, the entirety of possibility, including those possibilities not actualized but foreseeable given the right conditions on another, and then what materially does end up taking place once God has made a selection on yet a third. Knowledge that is both hypothetical and contingent, Molinists call counterfactuals, occupying a space of middle knowledge, following necessary truths, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but prior to the privileged final category of actualization. God merely takes stock of possible realities in which the creaturely subject makes free but circumstantially contingent choices, and then God chooses himself which of the free choice scenarios to endorse divinely. This, of course, raises the question of what good free will is to us if any reified variation left to our autonomy is weeded out by the overseer. Molinism at its clearest seems an implicit concession to the impossibility of free will as more than a convincing but ultimately illusory extension of the only verifiable epiphenomenon we can claim, consciousness. You can't have both perfect free will and determinism, whether due to physics or final deific approval. Protestant Arminians, also known as Remonstrants, on the other hand, are willing to openly settle for an even less attractive understanding of free will, saying that the most admirable choices we could possibly make, including belief in God, are not sufficient for the achievement of grace. For that, we need the succor of the Holy Spirit. The premise that needs to be re-examined before this conversation can be had sensibly is how rigidly or narrowly we are prepared to define free will. Boethius seems to have a sympathetic view of the pre-Socratic Eleatic philosophers and Anaxagoras, somewhat ironic given his reverence for Plato, who we just heard mocking Anaxagoras 2 dialogues back through Socrates in Apology. Nonetheless, Boethius rightly sees some overlap in their ideas with respect to the unity of existential being and the divine mind as an animating cosmic principle, which Anaxagoras called nous, or intellect. Boethius is not fond of the Epicureans, though he shared more in common with them than he realized, nominating as he does happiness as life's main purpose, but not a hedonistic happiness so much as happiness which is derived from moderation and goodness. This was more or less the Epicurean view, but their atomistic interests incentivized a campaign of calumnies against them from the Christians, who undermined them by painting them as decadent bon vivants. This would be the fate of the utilitarians all the way in the 19th century, who, when not being accused of possessing no feeling or zest for life whatsoever, were often misunderstood as meaning by their happiness or pleasure principle to advocate for a complete sybaritic selfishness. I hope by this exposition we drive home the degree to which Boethius' work truly represents such instructive connective tissue reaching far to either side of his own era. Thank you for staying for the post-dialogue discussion.